Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for July 22nd, 2022. Well, we're seeing a dramatic shift strategically in the world as the effects of economic collapse, crazy strategic policy, including the decision to take on Russia in a war in Ukraine, are causing consequences which either were not intended or were thought that they would yield a different outcome. And what we're seeing is a shift in thinking of many governments, as well as a dissatisfaction among people in many countries that are just the pre-signs of a dramatic shift in world politics. Let me give you an example of that coming from the Global Times, or I'm sorry, the China Daily newspaper in China on the coming de-dollarization. What they say is, quote, the weaponization of the dollar has aroused concerns of emerging market countries, and de-dollarization, which used to be a marginal idea, has now become a serious policy consideration for them, unquote. In other words, the era of the dollar as the sole currency and in international trade, and therefore the power of the United States and Wall Street and also the City of London to dictate financial terms, terms of trade, terms of financial transactions, that era is coming to an end, the so-called unipolar era. The dollar is suffering from a combined effect of the total debt problem in the United States, the overall decline in the US economy, and the reaction to the imposition of continuing austerity policies in order to protect dollar debt by imposing draconian conditions on nations of the South. Now, we're seeing the political crisis everywhere. Let me just give you some examples. In the United States, you have the collapse of support for the Biden administration. Poll numbers are below Jimmy Carter levels right now. It's due to incompetence, but it's also due to a dangerous policy course being adopted by the administration. The war against Russia, the green agenda. There's even talk now, after the defeat of the Build Back Better legislation in the Senate, there's talk that maybe Biden should go with Build Back Better through executive action. Precisely the kind of policy which would make it more unpopular. And then we're looking at the European Union, and you see the same incompetence and collapse, the miscalculation, the idea of unity is just being blown out of the window. You have the fall of the European Union's Draghi government in Italy. Mario Draghi has been a key operative of the City of London going back to the 1990s. Every step of the way with the consolidation of the power of Brussels over the member states of the European Union, Draghi has been there, including his stint as European Central Bank chairman and then as Prime Minister of Italy. Well, his government has fallen. It's fallen because its policies of support for the war in Ukraine against Russia and his support for more power to the European Central Bank and to Brussels is unpopular in his own country. It's not clear what will happen there. There will be elections probably in October, but it appears as though Draghi is at least temporarily out as a leading figure in Europe. Le Monde had an interesting article today on the broader consequences, the fact that both Chancellor Scholz of Germany and President Macron of France have been significantly weakened. Scholz because of his policy of sanctions, joining the sanctions regime against Russia, and the backfire effect of that on German industry and economy. And Macron as a minority government following the parliamentary elections that just took place. Le Monde describes the overall situation as, quote, destabilizing for the Eurozone and for the European Union. It's an existential crisis. What happens when the EU demands austerity on energy usage on member nations, and the populations of those countries rebel. In Germany, we're now seeing open uh, dissatisfaction with the course that Scholz has taken. President Kretschmer, who's the minister president in Saxony, who's a member of the Christian Democratic Party, attacked the sanctions against Russia and the weapons deliveries to Ukraine. He called them, quote, measures without any meaningful perspective, unquote. Interestingly, his comments, while they came under sharp attack from the German media, which is completely under the control of the British, gained support from Sarah Wagenknecht, one of the leading figures in the Linke Party, which is a leftist party in Germany. German farmers are now preparing to join their counterparts in the rest of Europe with street protests. Now, this is a continuing reaction against the Green New Deal. And we're seeing strikes and protests in South and Central America. Argentina and Pakistan are the latest countries to be on the edge of default with a Sri Lanka-style crisis. And the point is that with food, fuel, and medicine prices rising, people can't survive. A new system is required. And that's what the China Daily article is pointing toward. The end of the dollar era, the end of the era in which a group of financial conglomerates based in London and Wall Street can dictate terms to the rest of the world. Now, since it's Friday, I did have a couple of questions that came to me, which I'll take up. The first one is that someone asked, globalists have no choice but to press ahead with these policies, while Russia and China will not capitulate to their demands. How can this not lead to something more dangerous? Well, in the short term, it will be more dangerous. Russia will not submit. The Russians are insisting, as Putin has, on security guarantees for a sovereign nation, that they will not submit to the arbitrary demands of a Green New Deal or a Great Reset, or to the attacks on their populations, including ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. The fact is that in a world in which real international law, as opposed to a rules-based order, prevailed, Ukraine would have been the one sanctioned for its policies of killing people in eastern Ukraine who did not accept the EU and NATO government in Kiev. So the question then is, if Russia and China and others are moving in one direction and the rules-based order is demanding motion in another, what's going to happen? Well, either this will escalate to a World War III, which could be a nuclear war, or the bottom will fall out, as it's happening now in Western governments, and in the collapse, new coalitions will have to emerge. But what's necessary is a new policy. And that's why the Schiller Institute has been fighting for this idea of moving to a new strategic and new financial architecture based on the best principles from the post-World War II period, but going beyond the original Bretton Woods to establish a world in which sovereign nations engage in bilateral and multilateral agreements based on principles of economic development and economic principles of fairness to sovereign nation states, that no nation must submit to the arbitrary demands of the bankers of London and Wall Street. And that's where we're headed. Now, the question is, will that happen peacefully? Will it happen by agreement, by diplomacy and negotiation? Or will it happen in the aftermath of a collapse in which the outcome becomes much more muddy and continuing dangerous? Now, second question, which is quite interesting to me, someone pointed out that the U.S. Army is now going to be shrinking in size because it's been unable to meet its recruitment goals. The number of qualified applicants has fallen as potential recruits are not meeting the physical and intellectual standards. What does this mean? Well, I think this is something which Lyndon LaRouche had been warning about for many, many years. What happens when you lose a sense of national mission? And a national mission which includes the importance of a classical education for every citizen. What happens when the normal process of dialogue and social exchange is replaced by text messaging, uh, the Snapchat, and so on, where people are more concerned with the number of likes they get on social media than whether they actually know something, whether they're actually prepared to be competent citizens in a republic. And we're seeing the collapse of that. Physically, you see it in terms of the numbers of people who are overweight. You walk down the street in the United States now, and you see people who, and it's partly the effect of COVID, it's partly a number of other things, but it's also the fast food, the lack of nutritious diets, the easy living, which is not so easy, really. The people who lack money have trouble getting access to good food. But you also see it in terms of the inability of people to think, to carry on intellectual discourse. And this is now having an effect when the army goes out looking for people. On the one hand, there are fewer and fewer people who are willing to submit themselves to what's necessary to be a competent soldier in terms of the mental and physical demands. The army can can give bonuses and other things, but they're still not getting recruits. This is an example of a nation in decline. Think about the Roman Empire. Think about how it took 100 years or more for the Roman Empire to collapse. And what was the problem with the Roman Empire? The degeneration of its citizens who lived on the fruits of the slave labor of the outreaches of the empire which had been conquered. Eventually, that degeneration took over and destroyed the empire. That's what's happening today. We see it in the discussion of so-called gender equality, in the identity politics, which provide people with a narrower and narrower sense of identity, as opposed to a fight for a national mission. We have tremendous opportunities with a national mission. We're seeing the openings of the physical universe to us with the Webb telescope, the incredible images we're getting back from that, the potential for development of almost unlimited energy sources with nuclear fusion, with the improvements in agricultural productivity, which are possible if you break with the green agenda. But the green agenda itself is the result of a brainwashing, a systemic brainwashing over many years, which convinces us that human beings are a plague to the planet, to Mother Earth. And therefore, you're telling young children that their very existence is a threat to life on the planet. This will have consequences, and it's having consequences. So the fight for a new strategic and financial architecture includes a return to real classical education in poetry, in drama, in music, so that people can communicate profound and impassioned ideas, as Percy Shelley spoke about in his Defense of Poetry. That what's necessary at moments like this is an elevation of the sense of identity, as opposed to a retreat into the smallness of me, me, me. Can that happen? Well, it depends on what we do. Those of us who recognize the crisis have a responsibility to go out and explain to people why this is happening and what the alternatives are, and how the brilliance of the American constitutional system offers us a way out by a return to those principles, as opposed to the arbitrariness of a rules-based order where the rules are made in the corporate boardrooms and the gatherings of bankers and the World Economic Forum and so on, where they try to impose their warped view on the rest of the population. So thanks for joining me today. I think next week, I'm not sure how often I'll be here for the updates, but as all of you know, I have very competent and excellent replacements in Mike Billington and Jason Ross. I'll be on when I can. I'm still on the road, but stay tuned with us, share these videos, and make sure that these ideas get out there.